Our government has chosen to face global challenges the Australian way. Now, on the 3rd of May, you choose the way forward. Your vote has never been more important, and your choice has never been more clear. This election is a choice between Labor's plan to keep building or Peter Dutton's promise.
Our Australian government reporter Ben Westcott is in Canberra and he joins us now. All right, well, it's on. We're waiting. May the 3rd is the day. Who's best positioned to win at the moment? Polls have got it looking pretty close, and there could be a significant performance from independents as well. What are we looking at?
Yes, that's right. Finally, we're in the election campaign proper. And until very recently, we would have said that Peter Dutton was looking incredibly strong. The polls were moving his direction. But actually, since that Reserve Bank interest rate cut in February, we have seen a slight uptick for Albanese. In a number of polls now, his centre-left Labor Party is ahead, about 51-49. Now, the government is pretty confident given those numbers. They've believed that during most Australian election campaigns, votes swing towards the incumbent, and therefore they're feeling pretty chuffed. But there's no doubt that there is still a great deal of frustration about cost of living in the community, a great deal of anger that Peter Dutton will be tapping into in his campaign to make Anthony Albanese the first-term government to lose power in a century.
Ben, you mentioned we were talking about the Teals and how impactful they were in the last election. They expected to be this influential this time around. Will they be kingmakers?
I mean, they're, if anything, more important this term than they were last time. There's been this long-term trend in Australian politics towards having more of a minority vote rather than a vote for the two major parties. In the last election, it was about 1 in 3 votes that went to minor parties or independents, and there's no reason to expect it to change this time. We've seen similar results at state elections. Given that, and given the ever-creeping threat of minority government to the major parties, it's quite possible that the Teal independents who get elected this time could end up deciding after May 3rd who becomes Australia's next Prime Minister, whether that's Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton. So you can expect a lot of questions of them in the weeks ahead about who they would support, although I believe that they're all basically saying at this stage that's what the negotiations are for after May 3rd.
Well, we've had both the major parties unveiling their economic visions this week with the budget and the budget reply. Now, if there is a minority government, whatever flavour that is, what are those negotiations going to mean for the eventual cost of living relief?
Yeah, great question, Paul. I think in the majority, the independents are not terribly interested in the short-term fixes that the Albanese and Dutton parties have basically picked for their election campaigns. They're interested in far longer-term things. There's been a lot of talk about tax reform from some of the Teal independents. They want to see changes to get rid of bracket creep or make the housing market fairer by removing generous tax breaks for investors. All that would be supercharged under the Greens if they were to hold the balance of power. They want to see far more long-term structural assistance in the form of things like dental into Medicare. But then, if it comes down to just a couple of seats and Peter Dutton is looking in a prime position to form government, people like Daly or Bob Katter would probably be far more amiable to an idea of more shorter, soft-term cost of living assistance than the Teals or the Greens.
Australia Government reporter Ben Westcott there with the breaking news this morning with that election being called. Let's bring in Jill Sheppard now, who's a senior lecturer in politics at the Australian National University. Jill, great to have you with us. And I wanted to pick up that point that Ben made about sort of the sheer level of political fragmentation perhaps they're looking at, with Albanese trying to vie to become the first Australian leader in more than 2 decades to win consecutive elections. What's your view on this? How did we sort of get here, and how unhelpful is this in the longer term when it comes to actual structural changes and policy making?
Yeah, look, it has been decades in the making, this structural decline in the vote share of the two major parties. And the major parties have really shown no great willingness under our compulsory voting system to address this, because as long as voters are still turning out, then it doesn't matter whether they don't really like them. At the end of counting, that vote is going to end up with one of the major parties. What happened in 2022 was that a big bunch of independent candidates were much better resourced than ever. As Ben alluded to, they are even better resourced now and in a prime position to, if not take the balance of power, at least really influence the narrative around this campaign, the kinds of issues that are talking about. And as he said, none of the major parties is talking about tax reform. They're arguing over very small changes in the percentage point income tax rate, but only the independents are talking about structural reform. And as long as they're around, that will change the kind of campaign that we're going to see.
In terms of the outlook, it's interesting. If you take, I guess, a global lead, we've obviously seen over the past year or so a lot of elections around the world swinging to Conservative parties. At the same time, in the last few months, it seems like if you take a look at Canada, for example, there's been some strength being regained from Liberal parties post-Trump amidst this sort of threatened trade war. How do you think it's going to play out amongst the major parties here?
Well, I think we've seen Anthony Albanese's announcement this morning that he's trying to frame the Liberal Party as the Trump version of Australian politics. And whether that will stick with voters really remains to be seen, but they're certainly trying to tar Dutton with that brush. In terms of actual policies, effects of things like the tariffs, both the previous round and the round still to be announced, will probably affect some seats in this election. They're certainly not infiltrating the overarching narrative at the moment, and I think that's largely because both parties want to avoid saying the Trump word and are pretty risk averse in terms of looking too aligned with the Republicans.
Yeah, in terms of how that relationship gets managed, is it possible to see any difference between the two major parties? And again, we can't really ignore the potential influence of the Teal independents here, who may end up, as Heidi said, supporting one or other of the major parties to form government.
Yeah, the major parties are really trying to speak to a bunch of different constituencies here. And for instance, the Liberal Party is probably quite keen to talk about their ability to get on the phone with Trump and argue our case in any tariff war. But at the same time, they don't want to give any impression to the independents or to swinging voters that they are too close to Trump. I think what will happen as the campaign wears on is that the independents will push these issues more than the two major parties. But for the most part, they're going to talk about inflation and cost of living, which are effectively the same issue, just with a slightly different slant. And after 5 weeks, voters will be sick of hearing about it.
Jill, it feels like yesterday since Anthony Albanese won power. We've only got 3-year terms here in Australia. Does that make for, kind of a timid policy agenda? Is it time for have a national conversation around 4-year terms, or is that political kryptonite?
Both major parties have come out in support of 4-year terms. Business sectors in Australia certainly want 4-year terms. There's no great evidence, for instance, if we look to the UK, that longer parliamentary cycles do lead to better economic outcomes. I think there is a sense of fatigue, particularly among voters who are forced to vote under compulsory voting and don't really like what they see in terms of the two major parties. But on the other hand, if a government becomes entrenched and they don't seem to be doing anything, then 4 years can feel like a long time too. So I think business and politicians maybe need to be careful what they wish for in that regard.
This election, and rightly so in so many ways, has been characterised as one being based on cost of living pressures and very much domestic issues like the ongoing housing affordability crisis. I do wonder, how much do regional issues come into this? Obviously, the pivot away from Asia that we're expecting from the Trump administration 2.0, the influence of China. Are these issues that voters ultimately care about?
Voters in, for instance, central Queensland or parts of WA that have been affected by Chinese import restrictions or the tariffs now, they absolutely care about it. The problem that the major parties face is that they don't really want to get into a proxy war with China during an election campaign. And while you are trying to speak to for instance, steel industries in these areas that are being affected by geopolitics. You also have marginal seat battlegrounds in Victoria and New South Wales with a lot of Chinese Australian voters, and that ability to walk both sides of the street, was much more possible in a pre-internet era. Now anything that a politician says in Gladstone, for instance, is going to make its way down to Western Sydney. And so what you see is just a complete retreat from that agenda at all. And this is a massive issue for Australian industrial sectors, but also for voters, and we're not going to see anything really about it in the next 5 weeks.
Jill, we can't, of course, let you go without a prediction. What does the next government look like in Australia? Are you willing to make that call?
I'll happily piggyback Ben here and say I think minority government looks like the likely outcome. There's no sign that this decline in major party support will rebound at this particular election. The major parties aren't doing anything that suggests they've recovered that support.